Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. There are many reasons to study ancient Greek. Learning it gives you access to the New Testament and the writings of the Greek Church Fathers in the original language. It gives us the same kind of access to the ancient Greek authors whose works are the cornerstone of Western literature and philosophy. However, learning a language is generally a challenge, especially if you're studying by yourself, and do not have the assistance of an experienced teacher. In this interview, Professor Michael Boler selects 5 books for learning ancient Greek and offers some advice on how to study it. Dr. Michael Boler is Associate Professor of Classics, Director of the Honours Program and Program Director of Classics at the University of St. Thomas, Houston. He teaches Latin, Classical Greek, Latin and Greek literature, and ancient history. His area of research is classical reception. He is the author of Introduction to Classical and New Testament Greek, a unified approach, and the accompanying answer key and commentary to Introduction to Classical and New Testament Greek. The books recommended in this episode are, first, Introduction to Classical and New Testament Greek, a unified approach by Michael Boler. Second, A Student Handbook of Greek and English Grammar by Robert Mondy and Peter L. Corrigan. Third, A Reader's Greek New Testament, 3rd edition, edited by Richard J. Goodrich and Albert L. Lukaszewski. Fourth, A Patristic Greek Reader by Rodney A. Whitaker. And fifth, A Greek-English Lexicon of the New Testament and Other Early Christian Literature, 3rd edition, by Walter Bauer and Frederick William Danker. Links to these books are available in the show notes of this episode, and if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top rating on the platform of your choice. Professor Michael Boler, welcome.
Thank you.
Should someone seeking a well-rounded education in the liberal arts study ancient Greek?
I think definitely yes. I would preface it by saying, and I always tell my students this as well, is that when you're learning ancient Greek or Latin for that matter, I also teach Latin, but I'll confine my discussions here to Greek. It's not going to make you a holier person, right? One can, in a sense, be a Catholic and be perfectly fine and lead a full Catholic life and without learning ancient Greek, right? So I always want to tell them up front that this is no esoteric knowledge. There's no secret things that they're going to be getting out of it. However, right, it is an incredibly rich field to study, particularly to read the Gospels in Greek. Are you going to lose crucial information? No, but there's some really wonderful things that you get from studying the language, things which are really hard to get through translation. And so one of the reasons why I wrote the Introduction to Greek book that I did was to give students those experience of being able to read passages from Greek in the beginning that really kind of spark their interest. And you could see like, oh, okay, I see why translators sometimes struggle with this. But also, of course, as you said, right, it's not just the scriptures as well. There's also classical poetry, history, philosophy. So I think there's incredible richness to be found there. But I also don't think that someone should feel that their life is incomplete without having a knowledge of it.
But until recently, study of the classical Greek authors was part of a Christian education construed broadly. The goal was to draw not only on the wisdom of Jerusalem, but also on that of Athens and Rome. And that was true of the Church Fathers, medieval scholastics, the Christian humanists of the Renaissance, and even the classically trained theologians of Vatican II. However, now do you think moving forward, we need to recover the study of ancient Greek as an essential part of a Christian education?
I think it would definitely help. And there, in the States, there's a growing movement for classical schools, and my children are enrolled in such schools where they do start Greek. Actually, is early. I think fourth grade. So it's, about the 8, 9 year old age as well. So there's a growing movement. And I think it could have great benefits of learning Greek as well. But logistically, it's very difficult to do it, right? So, but it is. I think it has to be organic and be from the ground up rather than from the top downwards, right? So I don't think kind of mandated from on high requirements would be very successful. I think the most successful approach is that you have, whether it's parents homeschooling their children or sending their kids to classical schools, and then that kind of grows up from the bottom.
And does the study of ancient Greek inculcate any valuable soft skills?
I think it definitely does. I would say the greatest thing, and you get this, Greek does it very well, but other languages do this as well, is that it really does when a student begins to see that there's not a one-to-one correspondence between words all the time, it really kind of a light bulb goes off. And I tell my students that it's not a relativistic way of thinking about language, where if you see a Greek word, like, well, this word could translate it, this word could translate it as well. There's no one kind of right answer. One of the things that my students always pick up on really quickly is that my pet peeve is whenever they ask what the translation is for a sentence. And I always say there is no the translation, there's a translation. And sometimes this comes off as relativistic, which, there's different ways. There's no one way to say it, but it's actually, I think, the reverse. I think it's the intellectual humility to know that one's native language is not 100% sufficient at communicating some things. And all languages kind of struggle to communicate the objective reality beyond it. So I kind of use the analogy of triangulation. If you use the more languages you study, and Greek is a perfect one for this, the more you become attuned to the reality that they're all trying to express. So rather than kind of leading into relativism, I think it really begins to let people look beyond just kind of the easy one word, this word means this. It's like, no, okay, what does this word really mean? What are its range of possibilities that it's trying to communicate? I think another one that, especially for children, learning Greek is so beneficial is the ability to train your brain to memorize. And this is not confined just to language, but many classical schools are now reinstituting or reintroducing memorizing large pieces of poetry as well. Is that, study after study shows that whether it's through lack of reading in school or through technology, the current kind of generation coming up, their ability to retain and memorize information has never been lower since they started measuring these things. So from a very young age, to teach the brain to memorize, retain information, see the world not just through the lens of their own language, but to look at the deeper reality beyond. I think all of those are incredibly valuable to not just the intellectual life, but to being a human being.
But what you've just mentioned could be as true of any foreign language. But Greek seems to be in a class of its own when it comes to the cultural legacy, because the forms of theatre, literature, philosophy all come from ancient Greek.
Absolutely.
Ancient Greece. So is there not something else it has in addition to, let's say, other languages for valuable that they and their cultural traditions might be?
Oh, I agree completely. And on the first day of class, when I teach Latin and Greek, I always divide into two things that the study of Greek will give you. And one of them, I talk about just what it does for the brain, how it teaches you to think about the world. But then the second one is also what it gives you access to, right? And it gives you access to really the kind of foundations for the way we think today, politically, artistically. And so one of the, maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit here and getting too far ahead of myself, but one of the main reasons why I wrote the Introduction to Classical Greek book that I did was that in my classes, I had both students who wanted to read scripture, but I also had students who wanted to read Plato. They wanted to read Aristotle. They wanted to read Aeschylus. And so I didn't really find a book out there that did both of those things. So most of the classical books didn't want to have anything to do with scripture. and so they excluded it completely, even though it's the same language. And then many of the books for the New Testament, they'd said, okay, we're just teaching our people how to read Scripture, so we don't really need to get into Plato, Aristotle, Aeschylus. We don't need to do Homer. So, and I thought that was a great disservice because they are one language, and so to be able to have access to original text in both of those languages, I think is a really a great benefit.
Are the books you've recommended for high school and university students, or are any suitable for middle school students?
I think middle school, it would be difficult, right? I really think so. There's different approaches, and since I only teach college, I don't know. I want to be very careful talking about what I think is best for middle school, but I generally think the way that most of the classicals do middle school instruction is more kind of an inductive method, where they're not learning kind of grammar day one, day two. It's kind of a general familiarization. But I think there's great benefit to doing that early on. But then once high school years start, then I think there's a really great benefit of saying, okay, here's why the things that you kind of intuitively are grasping, here's why they do what they do. So here's the grammar, here's how all the forms for the noun. So I think there's a great benefit to this method starting at about the high school age, but I could be proven wrong if people have experience of modifying and using it for middle school as well. But I think in general, the inductive method works better for young children. And then once they get older, and another great benefit is that you don't really have to teach much about English grammar, right? If you're teaching Latin and Greek grammar, and many people today, in the States, there's just grammar is not taught unless you specifically go to a private school or a classical school. The way it used to be, there's no diagramming of sentences. You might get here and there, but in general, the pedagogy in the States is not to teach grammar. And so you have a real crisis of people entering university and not really knowing what a subject and a predicate is. So the ability to learn Greek or Latin as well is a great benefit to teaching students how to learn about language in general. But I think probably high school would be the perfect time to start this manner of instruction.
You mentioned the inductive method, and there are various methods, as you pointed out, for learning ancient languages. One teaches students the grammar and the vocabulary through exercises in speaking ancient Greek. Others focus on reading classical texts. Which approach you've already said that the inductive method is perhaps better for younger students, but which approach do you recommend for adults and why?
It really depends on how much time you have to devote to it. And typical universities in the States, I have students for 2 semesters. So I have to give them the complete grammar that you would get in, say, an introductory textbook in 2 semesters, and classes meet for 3 50-minute periods a week. So it's an incredibly small time. So we have to cover 20 chapters a semester. So in 1 year, you could get through the basic grammar book. You can't do that with the inductive method. Speaking, even composing, these are all fantastic things, and they aid greatly. But you can't do that in 2 semesters in a traditional college education. So the only way you can do it in 2 semesters is the other way, right? Is by teaching grammar. So if someone is, say, on their own self-study, it depends on what they would like. There are many great kind of online and intensive things where you could go and practice composing and speaking. We had to do that in grad school. So it's incredibly beneficial to compose in Greek as well. But just time-wise and financially, and people have busy lives, it's not for everyone. But if you have the resources as an adult, the inductive method could be great. But most people, I think, that would be a challenge, both kind of financially, time-wise, as well.
Well, as you just talked about the challenges of learning a foreign language, learning a language can be difficult and boring, especially in the early stages. What advice do you have for discouraged students of ancient Greek?
I would say I mean, again, this is going to seem very self-serving, but I always tell my students, life is too short to read made-up Greek sentences in the beginning. Really, I would say, and one of the main reasons why I wrote the book is I wanted all the example sentences to be real. And I wanted them to all come from cool sources and to be very interesting and grab their attention. So I think that, yes, while pedagogically it would be better to start with made-up sentences and then kind of go on, made-up sentences can be very boring. So, the very first sentence in my Greek book is the famous 1 John 3:16 passage. So I think that getting students to read real Greek that's interesting very early on is key, because there has to be a payoff for it. Now, I love languages and I love memorizing forms and seeing how they relate to other forms, but that's not everybody. And so I think really the sooner you can have real payoff to what reading things in the original language is the sooner you can get that, I think the better it'll captivate the students' interest more. And so I'm a big believer in reading real things, reading fun things. I really enjoy etymology for Greek as well. So we talk a lot about the etymologies of words, histories of words. So the more that you can grab students' interest and see the payoff, I think the better.
Well, first up is your own textbook, which, as the subtitle states, takes a unified approach. What is this unified approach?
So the unified approach is really just simply teaching the Greek that the New Testament was written in and the Greek that Plato writes in as the same language, because they are. And so it really is the split between them is so minor that rarely does it even come up when I'm teaching it. Now, as you become more advanced in your language studies, yes, you'll see the differences everywhere. You'll say, oh, okay, I can see that's an influence of Hebrew there. Or you could say, oh, I see this construction. You don't really see this later on in what they call Koine Greek, but it is the same language. So Plato could have read the New Testament just fine, and Paul could have read Plato, right? So they're not different languages. So they are the same language. It's really ideological. In general, classics professors, including myself, tend to be a bit snobby and do not consider the New Testament Greek as sublime as Plato. And so it tends to be also ideologically, they don't want to have the New Testament. So that's really the main reason why you don't see scripture in typical ancient Greek classes in universities that aren't religious universities. And so, and then again, for people wanting to read scripture, it's normally siloed off and not taught along with the classical Greek, because it's just seen as not necessary. And so when I was teaching Greek, all the books that had the New Testament, and some people would try to make like a kind of half-hearted appeal, so you'd see maybe like 2 or 3 Greek sentences from scripture in this chapter, but there was never any book that really had a 50-50 split between scripture passages and passages from classical Greek that were real, not kind of paraphrased or dumbed down sentences, but real ancient Greek sentences from both sources together. And that's what my students wanted. I teach at a Catholic university. That's what my students wanted. And so was really I didn't start off to write a book. It was really just from a need and not having any books that did what I wanted to do in the classroom.
Are there any other features to your textbook?
So I would say that the biggest features are that it uses both of them together. The other huge one is that they're all real sentences. This really can't be overstated. I always thought, why are all these made up sentences? Why don't they just use real sentences? And then once I sat down to try to write a book, I realized why. Oh, because it's really hard to find good example sentences. It's a big challenge, because you might have a sentence, oh, this is perfect, but then, oh, it has this type of verb and that hasn't been introduced to this chapter. Or you could have this other sentence that perfectly illustrates some type of genitive, but it has a noun that hasn't been learned yet. So being able to have, and this is why most books either make up sentences or heavily paraphrase them. And so that they're kind of based on the original, but they're not really original. And so what I decided to do was have the example sentences all real sentences. So the sentences from scriptures, nothing has been altered, not one iota. They're exactly as they appear in all the critical editions. And the ones from the classical sources are 98% real. In the beginning chapters, sometimes I would introduce words like is and the, because many of the sentences that are really good for beginners are maxims and proverbs, and Greek naturally truncates maxims and proverbs. And so what I was really doing was not making it artificial, but just more like normal Greek. So the inclusion of a couple words here and there, but they're largely by the 5th chapter of the book. I stopped that. So everything is real. So now what you have to do is have right next to it a few notes for things that they haven't learned yet. But it took far longer for me to research and find, because I had to just read through the New Testament line by line and jot down whenever I found a good grammatical example that a sentence illustrated. That took longer than the writing of the actual book itself. But I think the reward is really great that students start reading the real thing as early as possible.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.